Welcome to everyone to Stannery's last US Zoom tasting. This one is unique in the others. We have two winemakers. We're lucky enough to have two lovely people, wonderful winemakers. I won't try and make a contrived connection between them, but what this does have in common is not Pinot Noir and not Chardonnay, which is what we've been doing for the last couple of weeks. They've both been at it for 15 years. If we want to make a connection, 2005 was both their first vintage. And again, we're in this position of tasting the 18 and a couple of earlier vintages in the case of Greg's wines, but they're also in this position of coping with 2020 and what that has thrown at them. As always, please do interrupt with questions, and I will have full permission from Diana and Greg to interrupt them. That would be much appreciated. But we have one point of order. We have changed the tasting order from what is in front of you. So this is a bit to concentrate on. We're kicking off with Diana, and rather than the brothers, we're starting with the Petit Verdot. So Petit Verdot should be top left. In the middle and the top should be the Ranch, and on the right, the last of Diana's wines we're tasting is the Brothers 18. So if I can launch off with a good slug of Diana's Petit Verdot and pass on to Diana to tell us about this wine and about what her family and estate have been through for the past month. Over to you, Diana.
Thank you, Sam. The past month, yes, has been exceptional. We have made it through the fires without damage to structures or vineyards, so I'm happy to share that with all of you. It's been a very nerve-wracking week. My father had all of his animals and a few choice belongings packed in the car and ready to dash. The winery was absolutely circled with flames, but 24 hours of firefighting kept the fires off of the building, and our 2020s and 2019s are safe. And the fires are about a mile from the vineyards. So we're okay, but grieving for all of the people we care about around us who have lost so much. And fires are now part of what it is to make wine in California, and we're still figuring out what that means. The 2018 and the 2017 vintages were influenced, impacted by fires, and I feel like they are these shining examples of hope because they are so beautiful in the glass. And while it was, very stressful to live through those vintages, in the end, they have, nature's grace has prevailed, and the wines are just beautiful. So 2018, we didn't have any fires that were close to us, but there were fires elsewhere in California earlier and throughout all of the growing season. And the smoke was really quite high up. You don't get smoke taint unless the smoke is literally blowing on the fruit. So I have never had any smoke taint on Snowden wines so far, but I have tasted it in colleagues' wines, and it's not something you could miss. It's not like a corked wine. I'm not sure. You know when you hit a smoke taint wine, and we would never put one out. But 2018, there's no smoke taint anywhere. The smoke was much higher up, and it acted as a filter between the sun and the vineyards. And so it took me a little while to wrap my mind around what was going on, because, when you're making a picking decision, which is of course the most stressful choice that you're going to make during a year, you have this kind of sensorial database after many vintages, and you go and you taste, and it reminds you of certain things, and these sort of, it's a combination of animal instincts of when something is ripe. I mean, we all really know that on a deep, basic level. And then also on these very specific things that you're looking for in terms of tannin maturity and flavor maturity. In 2018, I was getting all of those signals of ripeness that were not in tandem with the sugars and the acids. And so they're not tracking with the numbers. Fortunately for me, I have always strived to make wines that are drinkable, which is to say with lower alcohols and fresher acidity. So 2018 in some ways was delivering to me on a platter what I've been trying to achieve every year since the beginning. It was, you have these beautiful ripe flavors at much lower alcohols with freshness. And so they have there's just this bright, beautiful dancing flavors, the 18s. I think they have such wonderful spirit. And actually, all of you, I don't have them here. I'm talking to you from Burgundy, so so much to say. My family's property is in the hills on the east side of the Napa Valley. And I was born in St. Helena, grew up in the Napa Valley. And went to UC Davis, studied winemaking. And then I moved to France and married Jeremy Sess, whose family owns Domaine Dujac in Burgundy. And that was in 2001. And so starting with 2005, which was my first vintage at Snowdon, I was commuting back and forth, bringing everything that I hold dear in Burgundy to my family's property. And so this year, with all the complications with COVID, it is the first vintage that I have missed since 2004. It was a really tough decision, but I decided that as I don't have American insurance, and I do have two young boys, that under the circumstances, it was just too much distance to put between myself and my family, and to risk being over there for such a long time. And so this year, I made all of the picking decisions through analyses and talking to people on the phone, and all the same with the winemaking decisions. So I'm talking to you right now from Burgundy, and I don't have the 2018s in my glass because they aren't even released anywhere. I haven't shipped them to myself yet. So you are tasting them before the critics have, and before it's been about 6 months since I've tasted them myself. But nonetheless, you're starting with the Petit Verdot. And the Petit Verdot was essentially left over when I came back to my family's property, and I thought, oh my gosh, we have 170 acres, but only 25 are planted, and the vineyards are at different elevations and expositions. And I had my Burgundy starry eyes, and I said, no, we have to do single vineyard designates. And I didn't get to that goal until 2013. And essentially the first thing that I had my family do was to convert to organics. And then we also had to replant the Brothers Vineyard because it was planted to AXR, which is a whole nother story. But that needed to be replanted. And so the Petit Verdot is a more recent wine that we're making, and it is essentially because I am no longer blending as much, because I have these two single vineyard 100% Cabernet wines that I'm making. And so I have leftover blending varieties. I have leftover Petit Verdot, Merlot, and Cab Franc. And so we make tiny quantities of Petit Verdot, just a couple barrels every year. And it is just so fun and interesting to taste this wild wine, which has very purple fruit aromas, and also quite brambly and spicy at the same time. It's very hedonistic. And it's just been fun to make it out of interest. You just don't see 100% Petit Verdots that often. And it's just a really juicy, visceral wine, and it finds its place in kind of exotic dishes. So when I started learning about wine, I learned so much from my husband, who was 2 years older, but being European, he had started drinking wine much earlier than I had. In the US, you can't drink until you're 21. And I really didn't start my tasting training until I was in college, a little earlier than 21. And he told me very early on, the joy of wine is in the diversity. And I think that this wine is an example of that it's fun to keep it fresh and new.
Diana, when you did go back to California with your Burgundy head on, were there things you were trying to apply with your Burgundy knowledge that just didn't work in California?
Well, I'm coming with a philosophy more than anything. And the first thing, the most important thing that Burgundians, I think, held dear was this idea of place. And if you want to really express the site, you can't put chemicals on the vineyard. And so that is something you can translate anywhere. And I mean, if you keep it to a purely philosophical level, like, you have to be ruthless about what actually merits being single vineyard designate. And that is the difference between the ranch and the Brothers. And so I can't really think of anything that you can't also apply to some other place. I mean, obviously, I'm not going to carbon copy our trellising or our spacing. That would be utterly inappropriate. It's too warm, and I'm working with Cabernet. So if you get down to like nuts and bolts, you don't want to copy and paste. But if you're talking about broad sweeping philosophies about what makes something special, that can be taken from Burgundy anywhere.
But Burgundy's obviously had hundreds of years to refine the great terroirs.
Yeah.
US hasn't. How dogmatic can you be? How much are you still learning? How special is the brother? We'll come to the brothers later. But in the US, just sort of, it's a general question on vineyard sites, and I suppose they're in their infancy, are they?
Yeah, the spirit in Napa, I can't generalize everywhere, but there's always this emphasis put on technology, on consistency, on analyses, and there's very little faith put in nature. They always want to control things. I really had to fight to have native yeast fermentations. I know everybody's like, oh, you're gonna have stuck fermentations and Brettanomyces. And I really had to put my foot down to keep industrial yeast out of my tank. And so there's just that kind of suspicion about this tradition that has been working very well for hundreds of years and thousands of years. And I mean, it's been 2,000 years in Burgundy since vineyards have been planted. And I would say that's probably the one thing, is just some trust. I remember when I first did my first vintage at Dujac, and I came into the cellar, and there was, you've seen it, there's mold all over the cellar walls. And I thought, oh my God, I have to sterilize this place. And then I realized that the mold is digesting everything we exhale. It's like a living filter. And the air in the cellar is really clean. I mean, you can just, all of a sudden you breathe it in, you realize that it's just immaculate. And so that's the kind of thing. Having a healthy population of the microbes that you want is much safer than trying to sterilize. And that, again, it's a philosophy that you can apply to every step.
Oh, the ranch then, as the estate has moved towards single vineyard, tell us about the past philosophy of the ranch and where you see it now in the range.
Oh yeah, okay. Well, the ranch has always been our second wine. Before I was doing the vineyard designates, I had the reserve, which was the best bits that were blended, and then what was left over went into the ranch. So everything is estate. At this stage, I'm so excited because we're going to start our organic certification next year. And which means that we've been free from herbicides since 2012, free from synthetic fungicides since 2016, and we finally found a phosphorus source, which is organic, which is being taken up by the vines. So it's all special fruit. And essentially what I find most exciting is those single vineyard designates. And then what's left over becomes a blend. And the ranch is meant for, it's meant to drink earlier and to drink more often. And it is kind of quintessential, a quintessential Cabernet blend from Napa. And then, when you move from the ranch to the brothers, it's less of an everyday wine. It's a really special wine that deserves some attention, that deserves aging, and has extra length, nuance, character, and depth. And that is single vineyard. That is 100% Cabernet, not blended. The thing about a blend is you can really fill in the cracks with a blend. But the challenge, and this is maybe more for my ego, I don't know, but the challenge of making something great without blending is much, much harder. And that is what I find intellectually satisfying about Burgundy, and watching one vineyard show itself in one way one year, another year, and being able to taste it blind and saying, that's Clos La Roche and that's Brothers Vineyard. And for me, that's the joy of the single vineyard designates.
What is the blend?
That precision, yeah.
The 18 ranch, what is the blend of it, the grape variety?
Well, I don't memorize my blends, but it's always majority of Cabernet Sauvignon. So it's probably 80% Cabernet Sauvignon with Merlot and Petit Verdot. Yeah, there was no Cab Franc in the 18. We made 100% Cab Franc wine, but there's no Cab Franc in the 18 ranch. So yeah,
And the Petit Verdot adds a component. What would you describe to people?
It's a 1% edition. It's tiny. And like I said, so Petit Verdot brings all of that filler that that you have in purity right there in your one glass. 1% makes a huge difference. It brings a bit of color, and it, like I said, kind of fills in the cracks.
Organic farming is so important to your philosophy. When did you start to think that actually now it's beginning to show an impact in what's in the glass?
I think the
vintage or over time, or
no, the 16s. They were really, I think that's the turning point when you could just feel that extra dimension of life. I mean, that's what you're protecting. That's why I think it's important to pick early and not too late. You want to pick living grapes, and you can just feel it, and it's not even something that you feel on your palate. Your whole body feels it. When the wine is living, you can just feel this vibrancy in it. That, like I said, adds that extra sparkle.
But not a popular family decision financially. It was
it was tough. It was tough because it's expensive. I mean, if you make one, I've gotten very into climate change and carbon footprint analyses. And there is an argument for using herbicides from a CO2 emission standpoint because you only make one pass in the year. And so it's much cheaper. We used to spend $250 per year on weed removal. And when we gave up Roundup and moved to mechanical means, which means you're going through every time it rains, and sometimes you have to go in by hand with a hoe, it cost us $32,000 to remove weeds from all of our property. So that's that. I understand why my family pushed back. I mean, we couldn't afford it, and really, we're still struggling to swallow that pill. And we didn't raise our prices. But now, which unlike when I was trying to make the case for it, now there's so much studies coming out about how horrible glyphosate is for the soil, for the people who are applying it, for the community right around it, and that it eventually makes its way everywhere. It's in rainwater, it's in our blood, it's everywhere. So and now my whole family stands by the choice of giving up herbicides, but it is hugely costly because you have to do everything by hand.
Question from Tom about the Cabernet Franc. Did you make enough of it to release it, or will it?
Yes. No, we were supposed to be doing a huge release thing about this new wine this fall, and I'm not sure in this current context how exactly we'll handle it. But the wine is gorgeous. It's so beautiful. I mean, Cabernet Franc is kind of the darling of winemakers. And now I would say the public is catching on, but it's always been a favorite for decades. It's been a favorite, but never had any real commercial success. And now I feel like the market is more open to the unusual.
So turning to the Brothers.
Yeah.
The first vintage of the Brothers. Tell us about the site itself. What makes it special?
Okay.
How big is it?
So the Brothers is on the very top of the property, and our property is on the east side of the valley, and it's on the very top of the hill between Napa and Conn Valley. And so just like Conn Cruz, it has that perfect aspect, so you have good drainage, but you're catching sunshine, and so it gets that little bit riper, and is a little bit more resilient to all kinds of pest pressure. And it's a 10-acre vineyard, but I cut out the very heart of it for this, and we sell the rest of the grapes. We still sell grapes at Snowdon. And so I'm really taking out the mignon of this vineyard that's on the very top of the property at 850 feet of elevation. So we're above the fog line, and we have slightly warmer nights and slightly cooler days at that altitude. And I would be interested to hear what you guys are tasting, because I haven't had it in a couple months, but I'm drinking something else just to keep you company. This is actually a 2019 that I had sent to me from the cellar just to check on things, and I needed to taste it, so I decided to drink that. But usually Brothers needs time, and it has just a lot of tannin, a lot of length, and kind of pencil lead and blueberry and violets are kind of signature descriptors.
There's loads of juicy fruit there as well. It's clearly the future is ahead of it, but it is delicious now. Sarah asks, what are the challenges of growing and verifying Cabernet Franc?
Cabernet Franc has a really tiny picking window. And so that was definitely the one that I was most nervous about picking from afar this year, because it goes from underripe to overripe with this. You really have to load that arrow and hit the target. You know, you can, other Petit Verdot is very forgiving. You know, for example, other varieties are more forgiving. It's just sort of a matter of taste where you pick it. Whereas Cabernet Franc, overripe Cabernet Franc is terrible. So I would say that is the biggest challenge. Yeah, the other challenge is that a lot of the Cabernet Franc that we have in Napa Valley is virused, and ours is as well. And actually, if one vineyard really pushed us to go organic, it was that one, because I was very curious to see about how the virus expression would change once you give up the chemicals. The thing about the chemicals is they kill the glyphosate and systemic fungicides, kill the microbiome around the roots. And those microbes are the bridge between the soil and the plant. And the plant, actually, there's a very sophisticated communication system between the plant and those microbes, and where the plant actually tells the microbes what it needs and gives them sugar in exchange for all of the nutrients and it'll say specifically what it needs. So if you have vines that are old or virused, and you are not farming organically, well, they will weaken faster. Those vines will not live as long because the vine is not getting what it needs and not able to communicate. So I was really, really hopeful that, and we saw this at Domaine Dujac when we went straight to biodynamics, but our most virused vines bounced back, and so did the Cabernet Franc. So I would say this vineyard of all of them needed the organic farming the most. You know, the brothers, those are young vines, and they would have been okay with chemicals for a couple of decades, whereas the Cabernet Franc really needed the organic farming.
And the brothers with the height and the cooler night, do you pick it later, or what's the picking story?
Yeah, it actually is. Yeah, so so I wish I had a map, but the Cabernet Franc is right next to the brothers, and it just comes in earlier because it needs to, from an aesthetic standpoint, it needs to come earlier. The brothers is picked on the later side. It's not the very latest vineyard, but it is one of the latest vineyards. Before that, I bring in one parcel that comes in from the ranch, which is lower down on the property. And so, yes, it's warmer there. And then also our Ricos vineyard, which is the other single vineyard designate, which I don't know if you get it in the UK. It's too bad. We have it 1 acre and we only make 3 or 4 barrels every year, but it's nice to have the brothers and the Ricos next to each other. But that wine is, it's on the St. Helena AVA. Our property line has St. Helena on one side and Rutherford on the other, but we're not in either, we're above them. And so, yeah, so those 2 vineyards come in first, and the brothers is the very last.
Remind me what the first vintage of brothers was, and then leading on to, from that experience and your experience of the reserve, what is the aging potential for the Snowdon top wines? What should we think of them as, and your personal taste? When do you like drinking?
Yeah, so the first was 2013, and that was a very tannic, tightly wound vintage, and it still needs time. The 05s are just blowing my socks off these days, and so I think that might be, 15 years might be the sweet spot. I should try a 13. I bet 14s are open. It's not the same as aging Cabernet is not the same as aging Pinot Noir in Burgundy, whereas, Pinot Noir will close and then you really are kind of wasting the bottle if you open it early. With Cabernet, you can decant it and it will come around and you're going to just see a younger expression of it. And so I think if you do give it air, someone contacted me through Instagram the other day about a bottle of Brothers 16, and they were opening it for birthday. And I said, okay, we'll just decant it 3 hours early and check it hourly. So just for your own education. And he said it was great. So I think that brothers who can enjoy it earlier just need to decant it beforehand.
Is it the US market, or is it US wines that you don't really seem to have the, oh, it's just in a dump stage, get out of jail free card? Your wines seem to be able to and need to be able to drink at every stage of their evolution. Is that a fair point?
I don't know. It's funny because, okay, so that 05 I had at a dinner in Davos earlier this year. And the Swiss, in their efficiency, I showed up at 5 to help with decanting. They had already double decanted my 05. And I tasted it and I thought, oh my God, it's dead. And then by the time it was the last wine we did, it was Burgundy's first. It was the very last wine, and it was absolutely gorgeous. So I don't know. I mean, it can go through a dumb period, but I would say if it does, then give it air, which is so, the chemistry can't explain that. But if it does seem tired, I would also decant it. And that's something we kind of learned in Barolo. They said, oh, you open it 1970, it smells oxidized and dead. And they said, oh, decant it, it needs some air. And then sure enough, an hour later, it's singing. And you think, this is very counterintuitive.
Thank you, Diana. We'll turn to Greg, if I may, but please hang on and we'll fire more questions at you if we may. Sure. If Diana comes with a Burgundy background, I think Greg comes with a slightly Eurocentric food background, that he wanted to make wines that to go with food. He wanted acidity. He wanted to cut down on the stereotypical higher alcohol wines. Started in 05. He achieved all this, but at the same time getting plaudits from journalists who don't necessarily love this style. So we're kicking off with the Lower East Syrah, and over to you, please, Greg.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Sam. It's really nice to have someone like Diana go before me, because I just feel like saying like, yeah, what she said. I think philosophically we're just like lined up exactly. I can go on a whole story of how we switched from non-native to native, and from non-organic sustainable to organics, and I saw the exact same thing. You're going to taste the cab coming on that has 1% Petit Verdot, just like the Snowden wine has. So if I feel philosophically this is a great match to taste these side by side. So I'll talk about what you're tasting with Syrah in a second. Just before, I'll talk about Washington. A lot of people, Washington's becoming more well-known, but in the beginning days, particularly when I went to Europe or I went to Asia, I would get a lot of like, are your vineyards in Virginia? Like, where are the vineyards? They didn't even know that Washington's actually another state. But I think now Washington is becoming, particularly for Syrah and Cabernet, it's becoming a really important market for the United States. And I was basically living in New York City. I spent my career running big restaurant groups. Like I ran all of Wolfgang Puck's restaurants. Sorry if there's some background noise. We have people in the tasting room. And I was running a big restaurant group in New York City. And I was trying to figure out what I was going to do next. I was managing 20 restaurants or so. And I thought I was going to do retail in New York City, and ended up coming to Walla Walla. And actually in the building that I'm sitting in now, it's owned by someone named Norm McKibben from Pepperbridge, who's kind of one of the founding fathers of what happened in Washington State. And we were tasting Syrah, and I went, wow, if I was ever going to make wine, I'd want to make that. And he's like, well, we'll sell you fruit. I'm like, I don't know how to make wine. And he goes, oh, you're a master sommelier. You could figure it out, or just come work harvest and we'll teach you. And I was like, yeah, right. We'll retire and start a vineyard. If anyone is actually thinking of that plan, I will say that winemaking is a heck of a lot more work than you expect. It may not be the most relaxing retirement, but it's definitely rewarding. So I would maybe rethink that. But I eventually came out here, worked harvest in 2004, and just basically said, hey, I got to come to Washington State to make wine. And for me, what I really liked about Washington is, as sommeliers, and when we teach people to blind taste and all those, things that may or may not be important in a wine career, we teach this concept of old world, new world, so new world wines tend to be more fruity, tend to be a little higher alcohol, a little less structure. Old world wines are exactly opposite, more earthiness, more structure, more acid, less alcohol. I found Washington and also Oregon, obviously the state right below us, you can kind of get this happy medium of a lot of fruit that we would find in California and a lot of bit of earthiness that you would find in Europe. Now, I say basically, if you want that, in our region, it's very normal to have, you'll see my wine picked from a vineyard like Red Willow, which we're going to taste second. I pick it very, very early. I've had that wine 12.5 alcohol. It usually comes right in at 13. There are people that pick it way, way, way riper. Washington is a state where our vintages are relatively easy and they're relatively consistent. And I think Jamie Good had a great quote for Washington. He says, Washington allows winemakers to be naughty. And so if you don't watch or you want to make a different style, you can actually make very, very, very ripe wines here in Washington. But, I look at it as I'm in an area that we have warm days, but very, very, very cold nights. So even though you have the potential to get very ripe, you can also pick very, very early and make it a wine that is very balanced and very restrained. So in my mind with Syrah, I think Syrah is well, A, it's crazy to start a winery, and B, it's even crazier to basically focus your winery on Syrah because you're getting into one of the hardest businesses in the world, and then probably the least demanded grape in the world. I don't know why Stannery still keeps us around, being a Syrah-focused winery, but we're happy that they do. I think it's a grape that a lot of people don't know what you're going to get. I give someone a bottle of Shiraz from Australia, a bottle of Syrah from Washington or the Central Coast. These are like light years apart. And I think a lot of it is because Australia really put Shiraz on the map, particularly in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And I think a lot of Cabernet producers, particularly in Napa, Syrah came in through Joseph Phelps for the most part. I've been down the rabbit hole to try to figure out where Syrah actually came from. And there's a gentleman here named Patrick Comiskey who wrote a book, The American Rhone, and even talking to him for hours about Syrah. No one really knows how it got here and where it came from. But I think that you can actually look at a glass of Syrah, and and I can tell if a person is primarily a Syrah producer or if they produce Cabernet as well, because you tend to get a different style if it's a Cabernet focused winemaker making Syrah, because they're I say all the time, having a Rhone program and having a Cab program, it's like saying, hey, I'm going to open a restaurant but it's going to be an Asian restaurant, and on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, we're going to do Szechuan Chinese, and on Tuesday, Thursday, we're going to do sushi. So go, and we're going to use the same staff. And that's really what we find with the differences. So you really have to watch. And we even basically separate our staff and say, oh, you're doing Bordeaux varieties and you're doing Rhone varieties. But so a really long diatribe on basically, I look at Syrah like I look at Burgundy. And, so I think to myself, well, where is the Northern Rhone? I'm in Lyon, depending on the traffic, 45 minutes, an hour. We get to Côte Rôtie, Roasted Slope. How far from Burgundy am I? I'm really not that far from Burgundy. I'm certainly closer to Burgundy than I am Bordeaux. So whenever we look at Syrah, I look at it from a Pinot Noir lens. So what does that basically mean? I'm looking for aromatics. I'm looking for structure. I am okay with, Sam talked about, maybe getting, not having a wine that is commercially released or commercially drinkable when we first release it. I'm willing personally to take that risk on the off chance that someone would actually age our wine for 10 years and then go, wow, that's a whole different thing. And I've never really tasted something like that. So we're always focused on aromatics. I do a lot of whole cluster. Basically, both Syrahs that you're going to taste, the 2016 is 100% whole cluster, so I don't destem everything. Basically, it goes from the sorting table into a bin, jump on it with our feet, crush it up. There's been study after study that basically says the human foot is the perfect mechanism to crush grapes. The key is we want to crush the grapes, not the stems. We want the flavor on the outside of the stem, not the flavor on the inside. The flavor on the outside of the stem gives us structure. It gives us this herbal Provence kind of flavor. The flavor on the inside gives you canned green beans, asparagus, really unsexy type of green flavor. So we want to be as gentle as possible. We like to ferment in concrete. That's basically our favorite way to do that. We feel that we get a very even fermentation that way. Everything we do is native. I was a little less afraid to do native. I was never afraid of stuck fermentations or things like that, but native fermentations can keep you up at night, particularly if malolactic fermentation starts. If malolactic starts while primary is going on, you have massive VA problems and you can ruin a tank in 6 hours. So there's some mechanisms to make sure that doesn't happen. And the winemaking team has to be really aware if we start getting a little VA, little acetone or nail polish remover off the tank. And then we age all our Syrahs in large casks. I don't know why there's like a 500-liter barrel, whereas if you go to a Bordeaux winery, typical California Napa winery, all the barrels we see are 225 liters. Great for Cabernet, great for Bordeaux varieties. 500, 600-liter barrels for Rhone varieties, for some reason, it's a magic barrel. And I'm not looking for new oak in Syrah. So our young Syrahs tend to be very fruit focused. They tend to be, I'm always looking for red and blue fruit flavors, and I try to avoid the black fruit flavors as much as possible. But to me, the ultimate, it's bacon, it's black pepper, it's beef jerky, it's great Italian charcuterie. And I think to myself, well, what does new oak bring to that? Well, that brings ice cream flavor, so vanilla ice cream. And, there's a lot of, Heston Blumenthal can get away with putting ice cream on, probably like smoked brisket. I can't, I'm not Heston Blumenthal. So I think to myself, what do I want? I don't want that vanilla flavor on it. I want the barrel to smooth out the tannins in the wine. So we always use oak from 3 years to 10 years. So I don't really want any sort of new oak on the wine. Occasionally we'll have a new barrel but it'll never be more than 7, 8 to 10% of the blend. Just kind of smooth out the edge, but not really affect the wine. So we basically have two different levels. Is probably the easiest way to explain it. So we have our Gramercy wines and we have our Lower East wines. If you came to the winery today, you wouldn't know the difference whether we were making a wine that's destined for Lower East or a wine that's destined for Gramercy. When we make the wine, it's exactly the same. We don't change our practices or anything like that. And so the reason we started this thing called Lower East, so all the winemaking in Washington State is basically Lower East Corner. And I grew up in New York and my parents are from the Lower East Side. So the whole name kind of worked. But Washington is a weird place because although you can buy estate vineyards, it can be very, very difficult to buy small parcels. The way Washington was created in the 1870s, 1880s, they basically went, go there and however much land you want, you can just take. Go farm it, go draw a big circle or a big square around a piece of land, and you can have that land. So a lot of our zoning is based on 40 acres, 80 acres, 120 acres, even 160 acres. So finding small parcels is difficult. But there's a lot of growers out here who they may have a 100-acre vineyard, but they have 1,000 acres of land. And you can go around and say, hey, up on that ridge over there, can we plant Cabernet clone 2468 in this trellising with this spacing, so on and so on and so on. And either they will manage it under your specifications, or we can actually send our teams out there to manage the vineyard and lease the vineyard ourselves. So we had 6 or 8 of these projects going on. So I said, we're going to have some young vine fruit. Our first choice for young vine fruit is always to sell it off. We tend to sell off all our fruit until it's at least 10 years old. But then sometimes we have some stuff and that's what our Lower East line is. I like to say the Lower East is vines that are 10 to 20 years old, and then 20 years and above goes into Gramercy. But again, doesn't really change stylistically. So 17 Lower East, it's actually a wine I was I'm really happy with. I think that for our Syrah, our younger vines are really kind of coming into our own.
Was the vintage easy for you, Greg?
17 was another smoke year. So Diana was talking about the smoke in Napa. Our fires tend to come from very far away. So we're right under British Columbia, so Vancouver and that area. And then we're next to Idaho and above Oregon. And all of these areas tend to have fires, particularly in the past 5 years. So we tend to get this high hazy smoke. And we were talking before the call started on what the smoke does and what the haze does, and it definitely affects photosynthesis. And it makes it a little trickier to be able to figure out exactly when the wine is going to be ready. But Washington State, we're all about harvest. For us, it's all about what's the last 2 weeks of August, what's the first 2 weeks of September. We're always looking for, cool August, cool September. We don't always get it. We got a little bit of a warmer August in 17, and then the haze in 2017 September kind of let us pick a little later than usual. The other interesting part about Washington State, we tend to freeze in October. I'm not really, I respect biodynamics. I don't really employ some of the aspects of biodynamics that go on, but you actually have to watch the full moon. If in Washington State, if we have a full moon somewhere between the 10th and the 14th of October, there's a really good chance we're going to get a freeze. So what happens is the cool air comes out of the mountains. There's a 6,000 foot mountain range to our east side. The air will come right out of the mountains, and the vineyard will go below basically 32 degrees. If it goes to 27 degrees, it'll freeze out all the vines, and all the leaves actually fall off the vines, and you have to pick everything within the next 2 days. So hopefully you are in front of that and get everything picked. It happened last year. It happened very, very early last year, like I said, right on the full moon, and we had to go and pick everything. But we've had really lucky, consistent vintages in Washington since pretty much 2011. 2011 was very cold, but we've had a lot of consistency. So, but I think the 17 Syrah for me has been I've been really happy with it because I've never compromised on style, and this is a wine that goes by the glass in a lot of restaurants. And we were able to make it in a restrained, pretty geeky style, particularly for the American market. The UK market tends to be a lot more forgiving to the old wine, to the old world palate. But here, usually the glass wines, you have to actually be riper and pretty robust. But both of these wines made a survey of the top 100 wines served in American restaurants by the glass. So we were super happy with that. And
so there's the Lower East range and then the Gramercy range. Moving on to the second wine, Lagniappe, my pronunciation.
You could say it like that. Yeah, it's a New Orleans word. It's called Lagniappe, which basically means something special. We almost named the winery that. I'm really glad we didn't, because no one can say it. Even my mother can't say it. She's like, "Hey, just send me that L wine," because this is her favorite wine. But this is a wine I always love talking about, particularly for the British market, because there's actually a British connection with this wine. Actually, there's a Napa connection with this wine too. So, like Dana was talking about, for me, coming from a sommelier background and not a farmer background, we set up our entire business on a blending model. I used to blend everything, and I figured, we could basically fix everything, fix all the problems of our farming, which we were very experienced with in the beginning with blending. And it's just become apparent basically since 2013, 2014, there are some vineyards that really just stand out. And Red Willow is one of them. So there's actually a Napa connection with this wine too. So in the early 90s, Andrei Chelychev, who is kind of one of the godfathers of Napa Valley Cabernet, particularly for viticulture, was doing consulting in Washington State with Chateau Ste. Michelle, and he's related to the Glitzen family at Cool Cedar Creek. So Chelychev spent a lot of time in Washington and identified Red Willow and the Yakima Valley as a real special place for Cabernet. But he was also working with a British master of wine named David Lake. David Lake had started a winery called Columbia and was becoming very, very well known for just great Cabernet. And they both decided together that Red Willow would probably be a good place for Syrah. A lot of people thought it was too cold to plant Syrah in Washington. I don't know why they thought that, because they planted Cabernet, but I guess that was the thinking back then. But Chelychev and David Lake really thought it would be a great Syrah spot. So For the first, from 1988 to basically 2008, David Lake was the only person to get fruit from that vineyard. One other winery managed to get a little bit of Syrah from the vineyard, and then David Lake passed away in 2010. And I happened to be on a panel with the owners of Red Willow, this guy named Mike Sauer, and we were talking about Syrah, and he looked at me and he was like, wow, I haven't heard someone talk about Syrah like that since David Lake. Gallo basically just bought Columbia Winery. They want nothing to do with Syrah. Do you want the Syrah at Red Willow? And I was like, yes, I'll bring you a check today. So we started working with the Sauer family in 2010. We started with 2 acres, and now we manage about 8 acres at Red Willow. So this wine, always 100% whole cluster, always fermented in concrete. Everything is 500 to 20 hectoliter barrels, so big barrel to really big barrel. And this is kind of the one wine that I really, don't care what the critics think, and I am okay if this wine takes 20 years to open. This is always our most locked up wine. It's always the tightest wine we make. You know, for the American palate, a lot of people would say this wine is very tannic. I'm actually trying to put more tannin in this wine because I want it to be, I want this wine to really hit its stride at 10 years. But I'm really saying, like, this is the geekiest kind of Syrah that we make. And we've been super happy with this vineyard. We started vineyard designating in 2015, and it'll be vineyard designate from now and until, you know, who knows.
Red Willow, will we look back in the future and think, wow, Red Willow really is a super special place, or will the world change, or what would you be? Crystal ball, where would you be?
Well, so, you know, the thing in Washington is our soils are relatively consistent because of the way our wine area was basically formed by a wave. There was if you know what the Great Lakes are, basically Montana was covered with a lake that was all of the 5 Great Lakes put together. It was held up by icebergs. Every 20, 30, 100 years, the iceberg would break and it would send a 1,000-foot wall of water through the middle of our state and then basically drain into the Willamette Valley. So formed our state and parts of the Willamette Valley. So soils here are very consistent, very well draining soils. It's volcanic. It's basically sand on top of volcano. So great for particularly Cabernet, but also great for Syrah. But really the key in Washington is altitude. I can't really tell you that, you know, Northern Washington is any different than Southern Washington, but I can definitively tell you that Syrah at 1,500 feet is totally different than Syrah at 800 feet. And one of the nice things about Red Willow is most of it is above 1,500 feet. For me, 1,500 feet is the magic number for Syrah in Washington, except for one of my estate vineyards, which is basically at the base of a mountain range. So it's very, very, very cold. Everything I try to work with is above 1,500 feet. It's the magic number. And we're looking to go above 2,000 feet. And I know there's a lot of people planning between 2,000 and 2,500 in Washington. So, and you know, the nice thing of our blocks in Red Willow, they're all 1,500 to 2,000 feet. So I feel pretty confident that we're going to be okay. There are other parts. Change? You know, I think, yeah, I mean, yeah, climate change has definitely made the vintages more variable. You know, I think the Master of Wines had a beautiful question back in 2007, 2008 on the exam, where the question was climate change versus vineyard management, discuss. And I think it's a part of climate change that a lot of people don't talk about is, you know, if you look at what happened, you know, I always like to use Napa as a descriptor because it's so easy to use. You know, if we walked in a vineyard in 1995 in, you know, Rutherford Bench, you know, they were still basically farming California sprawl. So what's California sprawl? It's basically your vines are shading your vineyard and everything is really unkempt. And, you know, for various reasons, whether people wanted the vineyards to look better or we wanted some ripeness or, you know, whatever, they and we up here too kind of switched to this vertical trellis kind of thing. You know, I call them the vineyard, the Palace of Versailles vineyards, where the canopy is all the leaves are on top and all the fruit is beautifully exposed. And you look at the vineyard like, wow, that's beautiful. And we had that up here as well. And we found that if we go back to this basically like modified California sprawl kind of farming, we're not letting everything just go crazy, but particularly leaving more canopy and shading the west side or the afternoon side. We can kind of delay and roll back ripeness a couple of bricks, where if when we were on vertical, we would see ripeness at 24, 25 bricks for cab. We can see ripeness high 23s, low 24 for ripeness. So I think we can kind of, for now, battle some of the changes, but everyone has to think about what they're growing, and particularly if you're running a multi-generational wine business, you have to think about what the future is going to be.
So we should probably turn to Cabernet. As a Syrah lover, you were always going to make Cabernet, or it was in the balance, or when you set up?
So I moved when I moved here from New York City in 2005. I was running very, very trendy, very hip restaurants in New York City, and I was like, I am way too cool to make Cabernet. It was just not going to be something that was in my purview. But like a lot of small wineries, when you start, you're basically making wine. It's probably you and 7 or 8 other people, all sharing a space, trying to survive. It's very rare that you can kind of buy your own vineyards and create your own beautiful production facility at the start. So my first facility, there were 7 other wineries, and I tasted pretty much all the major vineyards at the time that were in Washington State, and I kept looking at particularly this vineyard called Shampoo, which is not Shampoo, it's Champous after the founder Paul Shampoo. And I was like, that Cabernet is amazing. And then I tasted another Cab, and I'm like, wow, that Cab is great. And kind of looked at Cabernet and wow, I think there's some really great stuff out here for Cabernet. And so we started working with it in 2006. And what I realized is, Cabernet is tough. It's different than Syrah, where Syrah, you pretty much just get it right in the vineyard and there's not that much to do. But Cab, now we have to think about, when are we picking 5 different varieties, everything from Cab Franc to Petit Verdot to Cabernet and Merlot, and they ripen at different times. So now we have to figure out 5 varieties at once, and now we have to blend them together. We've definitely found, like Snowden, that the 1%, 2% Cab Franc, it's like magic. I call it basically like salt and pepper for Cab. But what I realized here in Washington is that if you want to, you can make Cab, like I basically cut my teeth on Cab that was like 70s and 80s Cabernet, the old Spotswood, the Mayacamas, Heights Martha's Vineyard. And when I tasted, particularly if you can't be as forgiving, or you can't be as geeky with Cabernet as you can with Rhone varieties. So there is a certain level of ripeness, and if you go below, you're just going to get killed by both customer and critic. So we have to be a little less free thinking with our Cab. But I'm also still very happy that people taste this, particularly Soms, and they're like, wow, that doesn't taste like what I'm used to from Cabernet. So kind of trying to dial back to what was the great, what's riper in Bordeaux, or what was less ripe in California in the 70s, the 80s. So, we look at it the exact same way. The only difference really between the Lower East Cab and the Lower East Syrah, besides Syrah and Cabernet, is the Lower East is mostly our estate vines. So we own about 30 acres of Cabernet between us and partnerships. So this is kind of letting our young vine estate stuff grow up. And also this area called Phinney Hill, which is about an hour away west of us, right across the street from Shampoo Vineyard. We did a 5-acre planting there, and so that's this as well. Those young vines maturing, basically.
Question: does any Viognier ever find its way into your Syrah?
Mm-hmm. So Viognier was interesting because when I first got to Washington, I was very interested in fermenting with, or co-fermenting with, Viognier. So why do you do that? Historically, it adds more color, it takes tannin down, it also gives you more aromatics. So if you kind of think about where they co-ferment in the Rhone, it's basically the colder regions. So you look at Saint-Joseph, Côte-Rôtie versus Cornat, they're a pretty good distance apart. Theoretically, Côte-Rôtie is a little colder, Cornat is a little riper. I actually use Cornat as a good comparison to the kind of the climates that you find in Washington State. But in the Rhone, it's really the cooler areas where they co-ferment. So I looked at places like Red Willow or our state vineyard, Forgotten Hills, which is really cold, and I have a little bit of Viognier in that vineyard. And I was co-fermenting all of the colder stuff, and I was like, it doesn't do anything. It just Enhancing fruit in Washington is never an issue, and enhancing color is never an issue. Most of the time, people go, "Wow, this wine's really dark," and it just wasn't exciting. It was just making the wine more boring. And then back in maybe 2014, we started working in this area called the Rocks. And if you're a Washington winemaker, it's very easy to basically go into the Rocks. You can pick wine at somewhere between 13.5%, 14% potential alcohol. Make this Syrah, put 50% new oak on it, and sell it for $100 a bottle. It's like a proven formula. But for me, it creates wines that are very ripe, very rich, very full throttle in your face, and not really what I was looking to do with Syrah. So we've played around on the Rocks for years. We finally found a vineyard that we love, but we had this one vineyard where it always came in ripe, and I had some Viognier left over. So we just threw it in the Syrah. And at the end, we realized, wow, it actually took the perception of acidity and went through the roof. It took the freshness, went through the roof. And I was like, wow, in Washington, if we actually co-ferment the Viognier on the riper stuff, you get this freshness that's relatively artificial, because it's not really, it's struck chemically, it shouldn't be as fresh tasting as it does. So we've moved it from the colder spots to the warmer spots. And we have a tiny parcel that we work with in the Rocks, and we co-ferment in the Rocks with the Viognier.
Cool. The question, I'm going to have to read this one to you. Greg, lots of winemakers making very different styles of wine seem to use fruit from the same grape vineyards like Champoux. Do you think this variation of style hinders conveying a sense of place? Where do you see this big variation in style heading?
You know, so I think it's a good question. I think it's something that I think about a lot in Washington, and I think the easiest way to think about it, or to kind of explain it, is if you are managing your vineyard, if you're doing your own work, or if you're working closely with the grower, you can really dial in that sense of place. You know, you look at you know, if you look at so at Phinney Hill, I have a block. It's an old vine block. It's about 30 years old. It's part of a larger vineyard. Phinney is about 200 acres. Quilceda Creek is right next door to us. And we pick considerably earlier than Quilceda Creek. So you got the exact same basically piece of land with different levels of ripeness. And I think the key to Washington is if you're in your vineyard, you have a lot of flexibility to really dial in that sense of terroir. Unfortunately, there's a lot of winemakers who never actually visit the vineyard. They basically say, hey, when this winery picks, I'm going to pick the day after. And I think if you do that, you basically kind of resort to the mean in the middle, and you end up picking stuff that's maybe not at the optimum level of ripeness, whether you want to pick early or pick late, you end up kind of in the middle. And that to me is where it can get uninteresting. So again, I kind of rambled on the answer so I think that just like everything in winemaking, it's the amount of time you spend in your vineyard. And if you look at my blocks compared to another winery's blocks, particularly on the Syrah side, you will see huge differences in the way that we farm versus the way that most of our other customers farm. Particularly for Syrah, every time I pick Syrah, I get this phone call. Are you crazy? You just picked Les Collines? Like it happened this year. We picked it September 1. And I went, yeah, it's ready. And the winemaker's like, there's no fruit. It doesn't taste like anything. There's no ripeness. And I'm like, yeah, but it's ready. And then they're like, oh, you're crazy. I'm going to pick 2 weeks later. Then they come to my winery and they taste the same thing that they had, but picked 2 weeks earlier. They're like, wow, yours is like so much more interesting than what we did. I'm like, well, pick when we pick next year. And then next year they call us back. They're like, you're crazy. You're picking again. So, you know, I think that if you're willing to be adventurous and take risk, you can really do interesting things, particularly with vineyard, with terroir or identification of site blind.
We have hit our hour, and so unfortunately, I'm going to have to wind this up. I look over your left shoulder, Greg, and I can see large formats of Gramercy, and I've neglected the UK, and we've never had any. So note to self, please, can we have some large formats? Thank you.
Anything you want?
Greg, Diana, thank you so much for this evening. Super, super interesting. And thank you to everyone for listening.